How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem, Daf 40, masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends, today we are going to finish the second parak of masechta Avodah Zarah, the second parak out of 5. And what we're going to do to finish the second parak of masechta Avodah Zarah is we're going to finish the mishnah that we started yesterday. And this mishnah, right, we had initially talked about things that are osur even ba'ano, then we talked about things that are mutter ba'ano but osur ba'achila, and now we're going to talk, right, and then in the mishnah that we learned yesterday, towards the end, we got to food items of an over chovim that are even mutter ba'achila, and we are going to continue discussing whatever outstanding items there are from the mishnah. And with that, we will conclude the second parak of masechta Avodah Zarah. So, friends, without further ado, we are going to start on Daf Lamed Tes Amid Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Okay, so says the Gemara on Daf Lamed Tes Amid Beis, 3 lines from the bottom, Vitoris she'ena trufa. Okay, this is actually going to be a shtickle interesting. So the Mishnah had said a taurus fish, which is a little, it's like a small little fish that is not like mixed up. What does that mean? My understanding is it's this small little fish that is kosher, but other small little fish that I guess are similar to it are not kosher. And I think you get like a lot of these little fish bundled together, and so you have to make sure that they are actually, that you're getting the kosher varieties. So we had said in the previous mishnah that a taurus trufa, that this small fish that is all like mixed up, I guess it's not a whole fish, right? It gets all mixed together somehow. So then you can't eat it because there's a concern that maybe some of the tameh varieties are mixed in there. However, we say here that taurus she'ena trufa, that if you have this small kosher fish and it's not mixed together, i.e., so we're going to see exactly what it means, but best the whole fish is there, so then you can eat it. Givaldik. So now, says the Gemara, Tana Rabban, and the rabbis taught, Ezri taurus she'ena trufa. So what is this taurus fish that is not mixed together? I feel like mixed together isn't the right word here, but it's like, I almost imagine like you beat it, whip it, take it, somehow broken and mixed together of sorts. Okay. So what is this taurus fish that is not all mixed up? Kol sherosh v'shedra nikr. If the head and the spine are recognizable. Okay, this is going to get a borderline interesting. So if the head and the spine are recognizable, so then it's considered not all mixed up. It'll be kosher. Right? We had talked about if there was fish brine. So if it was brine of a kosher fish, so then there would be these I think they were called kilbis fishes. Yeah, I think they were called kilbis fish. So when you have a brine of a kosher fish, so inevitably there would be this kilbis fish it's some kind of fish that is attracted, or I think Rashi says kind of grows in this kosher fish brine. But I imagine with modern science it would probably be that it's somehow attracted to, or somehow ends up in this kosher fish brine, and it doesn't end up in non-kosher fish brine. So if you have this fish brine and there's this kilbis fish swimming in there, so then b'meile it's a kosher fish brine. So ve'ezu tzir sheyesh badago. So what's considered a fish brine that has this kilbis fish swimming around in it, and it is compliant and it is kosher? Kol she kilbis achas o shtel kilbis shotitos bo. Well, if you have the fish brine and in it there are 1 or 2 kilbis fishes fishing around in there, so then it's kosher. If we had just said that one kilbus fish floating around there or two kilbus fishes, well, if already after there's one kilbus fish in there, it's kosher already, so then why would you need two? So, lokasha, it's no problem. Kan biftuchis, kan bistumis. This is machlekes Rashi and Tosfos. So Rashi says that what this means is that, well, if the barrel is open, okay, so let's say you have a barrel of fish brine, okay? You have a barrel of fish brine, and the barrel of fish brine is open. So says Rashi, in that case, one fish will be insufficient because maybe that one fish just plopped in there somehow, but it's not organic from the fish brine itself, meaning because the whole point is that if you have a kosher fish brine, so inevitably in the fish brine will emerge this kilbus fish. However, if the barrel is open, then maybe the kilbus fish came from some other place and it's not necessarily an indication that the fish brine is kosher. And therefore, if there are, however, two kilbus fishes in there, so then for sure it came from within the mixture and it would be kosher. But if it's a closed container, if it's a closed barrel, so then one kilbus fish would be sufficient because it wouldn't come from some other place because it's closed, then one kilbus fish would be enough. Tosfos says a kasha because actually we're going to learn later on in the page that we have this scenario, as we're going to see later on, that when there are a whole bunch of barrels and they're all open and there's one kilbus fish, or apparently there's one kilbus fish, Rashi would have to say it's two, but there's a kilbus fish in one of the barrels, so then we say that actually all the barrels are kosher and they just kind of fell out. And we're not actually concerned that it came in from a random place. So actually Tosfos says that when it's open, actually one, right? Because if we're concerned that maybe it came from some other place, or even the Ovid Kochavim put it in there, well, he could also put in two. But if it's actually opened, right, just like we're concerned later on, right, when there's a whole bunch of these barrels, and one of them has this kilbus fish in it, and the other ones don't, we say, well, it fell out of the other ones. Well, here also, right? Actually, if there are what we want is that if it's a closed barrel, for example, so then we would actually need two kilbus fishes to be sure that like it's a kosher thing. But if it's an open barrel, then we can say, oh, one is enough because like the other one may have actually fallen out. But okay, so it's machlekes Rashi and Tosfos about what it exactly means that if it's open or if it's closed. So Rashi says if it's open, you would need two of the fish. Tosfos says if it's open, you will only need one of the fish. Itmar was stated, Rav Huna Omar says Rav Huna Achete. Okay, this is taka interesting. This is taka interesting. Rav Huna Amar Achete Rosh V'Shedra Nicker, that you have to have, that it's only kosher if the head and the spine are recognizable. Rav Nachman Amar O Rosh O Shedra. Rav Nachman says it only needs to have either a head or a spine in order for it to be kosher. So this apparently means like some kind of a wider head. I guess kosher. See, what Rav Huna and Rav Nachman are arguing about, interestingly, if I understand correctly, it's a huge chiddush, because as we're going to see in a second, whenever we think of kosher fish, what are the signs of kosher fish? Fins and scales. That's like the classic, a fish is kosher if it's got fins and scales. It seems like Rav Huna and Rav Nachman are defining a completely new criteria that I'd never heard of, which is actually, so apparently tamei fish don't have spines. Okay, tamei fish don't have spines. All right. And also tamei fish will have like a very thin head, whereas kosher fish will have a wider head. So Rav Huna is saying that you know that a fish is kosher if it has both a wide head and a spine, then it's kosher. Whereas Rav Nachman says even one of those signs would be enough, right? Because, for example, a non-kosher fish wouldn't have a spine. So even just if you identify a spine, that could be enough. Alternatively, a wide head would be enough. So yeah, it seems like a pretty interesting chiddush over here. But Idmar of Huna Amar says of Huna Achte Rosh Vishedra, you have to have it has to have a wide head and a spine. Nicker has to be recognizable. Rav Nachman Amar O Rosh O Shedra. Rav Nachman says that if you have either a wide, if you can identify either a wide head or a spine, that would be enough to determine that it is kosher. Moser of Ukva Bar Choma asks, Uvdagim kol sheyesh lo snapi v'karskesis. Right, as I pointed out a minute ago, the classic signs of a kosher fish is fins and scales. And there's a mishnah in Chulin, I believe it's a mishnah in Chulin, that says that when it comes to fish, the signs of a kosher fish are fins and scales. It doesn't say anything about the wide head and the spine. So Amar Abaye says Abaye, Kitanya Ahi, you see that mishnah in Chulin, I think it's a mishnah or whatever, that mishnah or brisa, maybe it's a brisa. Okay, let's go with brisa. I actually don't. Let me actually look it up. 1 second. Okay, so that is a mishnah in masechta Chulin and Daf Nun Tes. So that mishnah, which only mentions fins and scales and doesn't say anything about the wide head and the spine, that's because, says Abaye, Kitanya hahi be'ara ufulmuda. That mishnah is specifically talking about an ara and a pulmuda, didamu reshayu litmeim, that their head looks like a tummy head. It's got a thin head. And therefore, if you go based on the criteria of the head and the spine, so then you would determine that these fish, these ara fish and pulmuda fish are tameh, because it's got a thin head. But the fact of the matter is it's tahor because it has fins and scales. So you could say that, look, really the criteria of Rav Huna and Rav Nachman are valid. The wide head, the spine, if you can identify these, then it's a tahor fish. The Mishnah in Chulin, which talks about fins and scales, is talking about specifically in a scenario, right, for the exceptional fish that actually, based on the head and spine theory, you would conclude that it's tameh. So the Mishnah is saying that actually those you would be able to identify fins and scales, and actually at the end of the day, it's kosher. Tosfos points out that actually this answer then doesn't really answer necessarily for Rav Nachman, who had said either the head, the wide head, or the spine, because even by these fish that have thin heads, you would still be able to identify a spine. To which Tosfos says, yeah, but we're talking about external features, the Mishnah is not talking about internal features like the spine, rather like things like fins, scales, potentially the head, but then this would be an exception because it's got a small head. Okay, fine. So yes, there is a Mishnah in Chulin that says fins and scales, but that isn't necessarily the only identifiers. If you could identify it by the wide head and or spine, that could be sufficient as well. But at the end of the day, it would seem that if the sort of ultimate determination of a kosher fish is going to be fins and scales, because we saw that even in a scenario where you couldn't identify that from the head, you could still identify from the fins and scales. So that seems to be the ultimate really identifier, and which is probably why it's also the most popular as well, is because I think that's just what the pasuk says. Kol sheyesh bo snapir v'kaskesses. Anyways, so where are we? Okay, fine, but these could still be valid. Omer of Yehuda says, "Avidim mishmei de ula machlokes le tabel betziron," that this machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman about is it the head and the spine, is it the head or the spine? That's only if we're talking about if there's some kind of fish brine and you want to be able to dip in the fish brine. Aval begufan, but if you're planning to eat the fish itself, divrei akol osir ache rosh v'shedra nikar. Everyone would agree, even Rav Nachman would agree, that if you want to eat the flesh of the fish itself, you would have to be able to identify the wide head and the spine. Initially, I would dip in the brine of, I guess, this taurus fish. I guess even when I would only identify one of the signs, I guess is the point. However, once I heard what Rav Yehuda said, the name of Ula, that machlekes, that the tabel, that it's a machlekes between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman Litavo B'tziron, about dipping in the brine of a begufan divakol also, but when it comes to the eating the flesh itself, everyone agrees that it would be also Achei Rosh Vishedra Nikr, until you see the head and the spine, until you can identify the head and the spine. B'tziron Nami Lo Matbirno. So says Reb Zera, once I realized that it's actually a machlokas when it comes to the brine, I stopped dipping in the brine. Amar Papa says, Rav Papa, Hilchisa, the halacha is, Ajay Rosh Vishedra Nikr Shel Kol Achas Vachas. Says Rav Papa that the halacha is that in order to, I think, even dip in the brine, I think is the point, you would have to recognize the head and the spine of each of the fish. Okay, fine. Meisve. However, we have a contradiction to Rav Papa's ruling. Chatichis sheyesh ben simin ben bikulan ben b'miktasan. If you have pieces of fish that have the identifying signs, whether these signs are in every single fish or even just some of them, and even if there's only kosher identifying signs on only one of 100 pieces, kulan mutaris, they're all permitted. There was a maisa with a certain ovikchom that he brought a barrel full of shtiklach, full of pieces, and there was a sign on only one of them. And Reb Shimon Gamliel permitted the entire barrel. So Reb Papa had just said that you have to be able to identify each and every fish, the head and the spine. And here we are seeing that even just identifying 1 in 100 pieces would suffice. Take Rav Papa. So Rav Papa answers, that scenario of the 1 in 100 is kishachatichis shavis. That is talking about when all of the pieces add up to create one fish, right? So Keilu, yes, there may have been 100 pieces, but it was 100 pieces of the same fish. And so long as you can identify in even just one of the 100 pieces that there are signs that it's a kosher fish, well, then it is sufficient. So meaning, so in that case, it was kosher because once we identified a kosher fish, well, all those pieces were from the same fish, and therefore the fish is kosher. But if it's all the same fish, then what exactly is the chiddush over here? Maybe it was just a coinkadink. Maybe it was a coincidence that all of the pieces of the fish like fit perfectly together. But the fact of the matter is they come from many different fish. Kamash Malan, that no, since all of the pieces of the fish seem to be from the same fish, and you can identify from at least one piece that it is a kosher fish, that is sufficient. There was a boat with a boatload of tzachanta, which I believe we said was the chilak fish that we've been discussing, which is a kosher fish. The sichra that came to sichra nafak Rav Huna bar Chinina. Rav Huna bar Chinina went out v'chazo be kalfe, and he saw on the boat that there were some scales on the floor of the boat. V'sharye, and he says, okay, there are scales on the boat. We're talking about kosher fish over here, and he permitted all of the fish. Amar le Rava, and Rava says to Rav Huna bar Chinina, mi'ika d'shari ke agavna be'asa d'shriche kalfe. How could it be that just because you saw some scales on the floor of the boat, that's an indication that the whole boatload is kosher, right? Rashi and Tosfos have two different ways to explain this. Rashi says that just because you saw some scales on the floor of the boat doesn't necessarily mean that all of the fish on the boat are kosher. Maybe just some of the fish on the boat are kosher, and you saw the scales from the kosher fish, but maybe there are tamei fish on the boat. Tosfos suggests that it could also mean that maybe the scales are actually from a previous boatload, a previous haul, right? If this is the fisher boat, who knows what's on? It is like a fishing boat. Who knows what's accumulated on that boat over time? Maybe the previous load was kosher fish, and those scales are from the previous load. Maybe this one is tamei. So Rav Huna bar Chinina went on the boat, saw some scales, and says, okay, kosher boat. Rava says, 1 second, not so fast. This is a fishing boat. Who knows what exactly is on there and from what and from when? Nafak shipur de Rava v'aser. So the sort of like mouthpieces of Rava, his people went out and said, the haul of this, right, the fish from this boat are also, you can't assume that everything here is kosher. Shipuri to Ravuna bar Chinna v'shari, whereas the mouthpieces of Ravuna bar Chinna went and said that all of the fish on the boat are kosher. Amar Rav Yirmiyah Midifti, says Rav Yirmiyah Midifti, Didi Omar Li Rav Papi. Rav Papi told me, Kishar Ravuna bar Chinna bitziron, that when Rav Huna bar Chinna said that the fish on this boat are kosher, it's only with regard to their brine, that you can eat the brine from these fish, about begufan lo. But he did not certify that the fish, by simply identifying scales on the floor of the boat, he did not certify that the fish themselves could be eaten, just that brine made with them can be eaten. Amar Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi, Didi Amar Li Rav Papa, the Rav Papa told me, says Rav Ashi, Kishar Rav Huna bar Chinna afilu begufan. That Rav Ashi said, that Rav Papa told him, that when Rav Huna bar Chinna said that the fish on this boat are kosher, means you can even eat them. And says Rav Ashi, Ve'ana lo meser asrina, we're not going to say that they are osir dekamar li Rav Papa, because Rav Papa said that we can even eat them. That Rav Huna bar Chinna had said that we can even eat them. But I'm also not going to say that they are permitted. Omar Rav Yehuda mishmei de Ula, because Rav Yehuda said the name of Ula machlokes letabel b'tziron, that the machlokes is regarding the brine aval begufam. When it comes to the fish themselves, divrei hakol ad she'rosh v'shedra nikar shekol echad ve'echad. But in order to eat the fish themselves, you would have to recognize the head and the spine of each and every one. So Rav Ashi says, it sounds like he's not really given much of a psak over here. On the one hand, he's not going to say it's osir, because Rav Papa's version was that they were mutter. On the other hand, he's not going to say that it's mutter, because you have opinions saying that you shouldn't be eating it. So sounds like Rav Ashi just kind of didn't necessarily give a psak over here, whether they're permitted or forbidden. Yosef Rav Chinna bar Idi kame Rav Ada bar Ahav. Rav Chinna bar Idi was sitting before Rav Ada bar Ahav Yosef Kamer, and he said, Ovid kol chavim shehevi areva mleya chavius. Okay, this was the Gemara that I referenced, or that Tosfos really referenced at the top of the Amud, which is that an Ovid kol chavim who brought a boatload of barrels. An Ovid kol chavim came with a little boat, and on it were several barrels. V'nimtzeis kilbis ba'achas men, and a kilbis was found in one of the barrels. Psuchis kulan mutar. So if the barrels are open, then they're all permitted. Stumis hi mutaris v'chulan asuris. And if they are closed, then only the barrel in which had the kilbis fish in it is mutaris. The other ones are asuris. Now, if we just back up for 1 second, so we had said, okay, so what happened? There's this boat that came, it had, let's say, 10 barrels on it. One of them had this kilbis fish in it. So now, remember, there's a machlokes Rashi and Tosfos about the open barrels. Rashi had said 2 fish. So according to Rashi, Misama means that one of the barrels had 2 fish in it, but none of the other barrels had any in them. But we said that they're all kosher because the other barrels also had, but that their fish kind of hopped out or whatever. Whereas Tosfos had said when they're open, Sataka, 1 fish would actually be enough. You could assume that there was another fish there and it actually hopped out, just like with all the other ones. We're saying both fish taka hopped out. But if you can, you can identify 1 fish in one of the open barrels, then all of the open barrels are permitted. But if they're closed, so then only the barrel with the fish in it would be permitted. Okay, fine. Now, Omar lay, so Rav Ada bar Ahava says to Rav Chinna bar Idi, min halach, how do you know this? Halacha mitlosa kra'e. Shmiya li mirav u'shmuel from Rabbi Yochanan. I heard it from Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan, who are so choshev that it's as if there was like a pasuk in the Torah. That's pretty cool. That meaning, that we rely upon, or in this context, he's saying, I learned it from Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan, who are so reliable, who are treated in such high regard, as if we had 3 psukim in the Torah saying this halach. Wow, that's pretty cool. Amar Broneth Amal Rov Kirvei Dagim Beubrin. Okay, the fatty intestines of fish and their roe. I think, what's fish roe? I think fish roe is like fish eggs. That's what I'm going to call them. I hope that's what it is. So Amar Brona Amar Rab, Kirvei Dagim, the fatty intestines of fish, ve'ubron, and their roe, ein nikachin ela min hamumche, can only be purchased from an expert. Okay, fine. So if you want to purchase the fatty intestines of a fish or the eggs, you must go to an expert to confirm that they are kosher. Ramilei Ula Reb Dostai, Ula asked Reb Dostai, Demin Beiri midika Amar Rav, Kirbe Dogim ve'ubron enikhin elo min amumche. Well, from the fact that Rav says that if you want to eat the fatty intestines or the eggs of a fish, you have to go to the expert. Why do you have to go to the expert? Well, to make sure that they're coming from a kosher fish and not from a non-kosher fish. Well, Michlal, that implies Tidog Tome Islay Uber. Well, that would imply that Tame fishes have roe. Let's just call them roe, because I think that's, why not? Either eggs or roe. I hope they're the same thing. I'll use them interchangeably. I just said roe. Great. So this implies the fact that we have to go to the expert to make sure that the roe is kosher. It implies that, well, we want to make sure that this roe isn't coming from a non-kosher fish. So Michlal the dog tame is uber, implying that a non-kosher fish has roe. Very many, but we have a contradiction. Dog tame mashritz, that a dog tame does not lay eggs, does not excrete. Let's say, I feel like that's not the best word here, but could work functionally. That a tame fish does not excrete eggs, rather it excretes actual fish. Right? Dog tame mashritz, it just excretes fish, whereas dog tahor matil beitzim, whereas a kosher fish will lay eggs, will excrete eggs. So apparently, tame fishes don't have roe. So what would you have to go to the expert for? Obviously, if there's roe, it's going to be from a kosher fish. Sami mikan uban. So the Gemara says, good point, right? Reb Dostai Minberi answers that just get rid of, the roe doesn't belong there. You don't need to go to an expert to confirm that the roe is kosher, because roe is automatically kosher because it will have come from a kosher fish. Amalei Reb Zera lo tesame. Whereas Reb Zera says, don't touch a thing. You do have to go to an expert for the roe as well. Tarvayu matile beitzim ninu. Both kosher fish and non-kosher fish have roe. Ella ze mashritz mi bachutz v'ze mashritz mi bifnim. The difference is that the tame fish, their eggs hatch inside their bellies. So by the time for excretion comes, fish are being excreted from tame fish, whereas the kosher fish actually excrete the eggs. But both have eggs. The question is, at what stage are they hatched? So lamali mumche, okay, period. Okay, so they both, so both kosher fish and non-kosher fish have roe. Now, frek the Gemara, lama li mumche. Why do I need an expert? Because, after all, libdok bit simonin. Just check the roe yourself. There are signs, right? Just like by fish, for example, fins and scales, right? So every time I go to the fish market, I don't take my fish to an expert to confirm that it's kosher. If there are fins and scales, it's kosher. So why don't we just look at the roe ourselves? There are identifiers to identify that the roe is kosher, and let us just make our own decision. Why do we need an expert? The Tanya is within the Brisa, kisimane beitzim, like the signs of bird eggs, kach simane dagim, so are the signs of fish. Simane dagim, sakadatich, simane dagim, snapi b'kaskeses. Ksivu. What do you mean what does the signs of bird eggs have to do with fish? Fish, the signs are fins and scales. Rather, what it means is like the signs of bird eggs, so are the signs of the roe of fish. And these are the signs of bird eggs that are a determining factor for fish roe. And here I am going to pull out the art scroll because there are some not the easiest words here. Okay, here we go. Where are we? These are the signs of kosher birds' eggs. Kol shekoteres ve'agulgelis, any that narrows and whose sides are round. V'rosha echad kad, v'rosha echad chad, so that one of its ends is flat and its other end is pointed. Tehora, in this case, it is kosher. Shnei rosha echadin, but if both its ends are pointed, or shnei rosha kadin, or if both its ends are flat, Tameya, it is non-kosher. Chelmun mibachutz v'chelmun mibifnim. If the yolk is on the outside and the albumin is on the inside, don't know what that is. Tameya, it is not kosher. Chelmun mibachutz v'chelmun mibifnim. If the albumin is on the outside and the yolk is on the inside, wait, but chelbonim are like, what's chelbonim in Hebrew? I think that's carbohydrates, right? I don't know. Tahor, it's kosher. Chelbon v'chelmon moravin zebazeh. If the albumin and the yolk are mixed together, Zoe beitzas sheretz. This is the egg of a sheretz. Thank you very much. So basically, the point is that there are signs of kosher bird eggs, and those signs could be applied to kosher fish eggs. So what's the role of the expert here? So answers the Gemara, if I could find where we are. Omaravik Shenimoku says, Rave, you need the expert when the roe has dissolved somewhat. If the roe has dissolved and it is difficult to tell these signs, that is where the big guns come in. That is where you go to the expert. Now, according to Dostar Berry, who said that there are no non-kosher fish eggs and therefore just remove it from the list, the Omer Sami Mikan Uban, who says remove the roe from the list because there is only kosher fish roe. But we learned about simani beitzim, but didn't we say that just like the signs of bird eggs, kach simani ubre dogim, so are the signs of fish eggs? So apparently there are non-kosher fish eggs and we have to compare them. Lo terute matratztale, but to which Rav Dostai Demin Berry would respond, well, wait a second, hold up. That is not actually an honest quotation of that brisa, right? You asked me from a brisa that says Kisimani Besim Kachsimani Ube Dogim. That's not what it said. The brisa had initially said Kisimani Besim Kachsimani Dogim. Initially, the brisa had said, like the signs of bird eggs, so are the signs of fish, to which we said, that's weird, because what happened to fins and scales? To which we said, okay, fine, stop talking about fish eggs, but you answered the brisa that way. I will answer it in the following way. Kach simone kirve dogim. That just like you have signs for bird eggs, those signs can be applied to the fatty intestines of fish. Ve'echi mishkachas b'simone kirve dogim she'e kad v'chad. Where do we find by the fatty intestines of fish that they have these signs that are like, right, flat and pointy, that are like the bird eggs? Mishkachas la b'shilpucha. We find it in the air bladder, whatever that is. Ein sham, okay, zeu. So the air bladder of the fish is like bird eggs. Okay. Now what do you do if the fish eggs are a little bit dissolved, and so you need a mumche, but there is no mumche? What do you do? Rav Yehuda says, Rav Yehuda Kavan de Omer, once the fishmonger says, Ani melachtim, I salted the fish myself, and I can attest that it's a kosher fish, mutarin, so you can eat the eggs. Rav Nachman Omer says, Rav Nachman Yomer, Elu dogim ve'elu kirved. Rav Nachman says, in order to be able to eat the eggs, if they are dissolved, the fishmonger would have to say, look, here are the eggs, and this is the fish that it came from. You could see it's a kosher fish. Rav Yehuda paskined for Ada, the caterer, came the Omer Ani Melachtim Mutarid. That Rav Yehuda paskined that for Ada, the caterer, that once the fishmonger can say, I myself salted them, and they come from a kosher fish, the fishmonger can be trusted. So now moving on in the Mishnah. Ve'olah shel chiltis, and a leaf from chiltis. Chiltis was this very sharp thing, and there was a concern about maybe the sharpness of the thing interacting with whatever, if the Ovid Chacham used a knife that was used for, let's say, the day before for pork, and even though now today would be nosin tam lefgam, but because of the sharpness of the thing, of the chiltis, it would sweeten up the flavor in the knife, and it would be nosin tam lefshvach. But anyways, pshita lo nitzu. So the thing is, if we're talking about the leaf, though, you don't need a knife to cut the leaf. So pshita, so then obviously it should be mutter ba'achila lo nitzucha ela likrotin shabo. But on the leaf, there are also grains, and we had said that the grains are actually problematic because of the knife. So I might be concerned that maybe the grains that come with the leaves can get mixed together with the grains that were cut with the knife. Kamash malon teha ishtaruk eudi ishtaruk ve'osa ba'idot, which we say, no, these grains are not mixed together with non-kosher grains. Whatever grains you're seeing with the leaves are grains that fell with the leaves. No vessel was used in their getting mixed in. And if you have these olive cakes of sorts that you press together a bunch of olives into some kind of a mass, pshita, obviously it should be okay. What are we concerned about? Even though they're really, really soft, Maldatema may have thought that maybe to get them so soft, the Ovid Chacham put in wine, and then that gets tricky. Kamash malon hanimach mas mishcha huderafu, that they became so soft because of the oil, and I guess we're assuming that oil is not a problem. Rabbi Yossi omer shlochin asurin. Rabbi Yossi says shlochin are forbidden. Yechidam shlochin, what a shlochin of Rabbi Yossi b'Chanina. Kol she'ochazo biyad v'gar inoso nishmetes. If you can pick up the olive and its pit slips right out, that's shlochin. And I guess in order to get it that soft, you have to add wine, and therefore it is a problem. The grasshoppers that come from the storage area, those are permitted. But the grasshoppers that come from in front of the store, those are forbidden because he adds wine to those grasshoppers. Grasshoppers, vakafrisin. What are kafrisin? Those were from the, I think the kafrisin, those are the things from the capers, right? I think the outer shells of the capers, vakaflutis and leeks. Haban mina otzer that come from the storage area, umina heftik, or from also the storage area, umina sfina, or from the boat, mutar, and those are allowed. And karim bekatluza lefnei vani, but those that are sold in the market in front of the shopkeeper, asurin, those are not allowed in because the shopkeeper is going to pour wine on them. And similarly, apple cider. The apple cider that comes from the storage areas, so that is permitted. But the ones that are sold in the market, at the front of the store, also those are also because there is wine mixed into it. One time, Rebbe had a terrible stomach malady. Does anybody here know if the apple cider of the Chovim is kosher or not? The fun of Rabbi Yishmael. And Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi says to Rebbe, one time my father Rabbi Yossi had a terrible stomach virus of sorts, intestinal situation. And they brought him apple cider from the Ovdei Chovim, 70-year-old apple cider. Wow, sheesh. Has anybody ever drinking a 70-year-old spirit? That sounds cool. I don't think I ever had a 70-year-old spirit. What was the oldest I ever had? I don't know. Probably not more than like 20-something would be my guess. 70-year-old spirit. V'shasav v'nisrape, and my father of Yossi drank this 70-year-old apple cider and was healed. Amlo, kolkach oy biodcho bata mitzareni. Rebbe says to Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, what? You knew this information? You knew this? You could have told me. Why didn't you tell me? Anyways, badku matzu v'chol mechad shelo shlosh meos garve. Yain shel tapuchim shel ayin shana. So they went and they researched and they found that Ovikov had 300 barrels. Now, of course, whenever we say 300, it's generally a guzma, an exaggeration. But they found a supplier with apple cider, 70-year-old apple cider, v'shosef nesape, and Rebbe drank it and was healed. Omer baruch hamakom shemasar elam l'shavim. He said, thank God that He gave the world two guardians. I think the point I saw in the art school, I think he quoted the Marsha, that the guardians meaning distillers, people who, right? I don't know about 70-year-old cider, but we drink spirits, we drink whiskeys and things that are, however old they are. 10 years old, 12 years old, 15, 18, 21, whatever it is, you have these people who are just keeping an eye and watching these drinks, these spirits as they ferment. So thank God that there are people who are fermenters so that these spirits are available. V'chein the truma, and similarly for truma, my v'chein the truma. What does it mean? And similarly for truma, Rav Sheshes, v'chein the koyin achashud limkor truma l'shem chulin. For example, if you have a kohen who is suspected of selling truma as chulin, because truma, while it is allowed to be sold, it fetches a much lower price because there's much less demand. The only people that are interested in buying it are the kohanim. So therefore, truma is a lot cheaper to buy than chulin. So you might have a kohen who is taking truma, and instead of selling it as truma, which will fetch a lower price, he's selling it as chulin, which is a big problem because a zar that eats truma, it's misavidei shamayim. So v'chein l'truma omer Rav Sheshes v'chein l'koyin achashud limkor truma l'shem chulin, and similarly a koyin who is suspected of selling truma for a higher price as chulin. The fun of the aser in right. So if you're buying, let's say, grain in front of this suspected koyin, so the stuff that he has in front of him is also abamina otzer, mina heftik, mina slula, but whatever grains he pulls out of his storage area, mutter, that is permitted. Irtuse mirases savar shami be'rabban mafzedulim minoi, because at the front of the store, or let me start like this: in the back of the store, that's where he has lots of larger quantities, and then he takes out smaller quantities and brings it to the front of the store. So if he gets busted for selling truma as chulin in the front of the store, so they'll throw out the small quantity there as the front of the store. If he gets busted in his storage area, well, then that's a significant loss. So therefore, if he's taking it out of the storage area, you can assume whatever he has there, he's not going to risk playing games with, and that is going to be chulin, right? And whatever, everything will be labeled properly at least, right? Truma is truma, chulin is chulin. You're not going to make it. Nothing's going to be mixed up. You're not going to be getting. So there's not going to be any sleight of hand. But at the front of the store, then if there's a kohen who's suspected, then you shouldn't be buying from the front of the store, because there he might be pulling shtick and selling truma as chulin, because he figures even if he gets busted, he's just going to lose that smaller amount. It's worth his risk in his eyes. Hadron oloch ein mamidin. With that, we conclude the second parak of masechta Avodah Zarah. Today, we basically wrapped up the final mishnah of the second parak of Avodah Zarah, related to what kinds of fish you can eat. Fish intestines, fish eggs, taurus fish, different signs of fish, big heads, spines, very technical things, kind of wrapping up things that are things of the chum that are mutter ba'achila. I hope you enjoyed. Peace.